Christian apologetics, defending the faith and explaining why the Bible is true, can sound impressive at first. But defending the Bible often means defending some really troubling things: genocide, slavery, and other acts of violence. It raises a question. When the goal is just to defend the text, what lines are believers willing to cross, and what happens to their sense of morality?
Today we're joined by Chris Cornthwaite, who has several credentials, including a Master of Divinity, Master of Arts in Theology, and a PhD in Christian origins, to explore these tensions and to look at the pitfalls of apologetics. Chris, thanks for sitting down with us today.
Thank you for having me.
So when people hear the word apologetics, they often think of debates or arguments, but how would you define it more broadly?
I think the really simple, obvious answer is to say, apologia is to give an answer, which is kind of, I think, like what you get the classical idea throughout Christian history. You do hear the word apologetics from very early on from people like Justin Martyr. But I think the way that I understand it in a modern sense is primarily Christian apologists is a very specific kind of cultural manifestation of, I think I could say American evangelicalism, but at least of this kind of like Western evangelical moment. There are apologists in other traditions, but most of my engagement with apologetics has been this kind of evangelical apologist, and it really stems from defending a lot of kind of modern evangelical presuppositions, one of which that I rail on a lot because I'm trained as a Bible scholar, is the idea that the Bible is the inerrant, infallible Word of God. So I think that's in practice what it ends up being. It ends up being somebody who defends this very kind of narrow fundamentalist set of presuppositions, even though I often will have apologists push back to me as well and say, well, no, anyone's an apologist. If you have a position and you defend it, you're an apologist. And there's something to that, but there's also not, because I don't really think that's what we're usually talking about. So usually it is that presupposition that's an important part of it.
Right. You're assuming that the Bible is true and good, and that everything that God does in the Bible is also true and good. It begins with the belief and not evidence, and then sort of goes backwards to defend it.
Exactly right. Yeah.
That sort of raises a dilemma that if, is something good because God commands it, or does God command it because it's good?
I guess I would want to step back a little bit more and ask some more meta questions, for example. So like the question is, if the Bible says something, is that God saying something? And that's certainly the way that a lot of us were raised to see the Bible, is that essentially this is just God speaking. And that's why you do have people trying to wrestle with, like, for example, like slaughtering the Canaanites or something, right? It's a famous one. And you do see people trying to defend that and trying to explain, well, it's okay. God can kill people if God wants to, because, God's God and God gets to make those kind of decisions. But when you actually take a step back and you ask, like, where does that belief that the Bible is, God doing something or God speaking? Like, what if I looked at the Bible and said, this is maybe this is a record of what people thought they saw God doing, but some of it is probably pretty horrific and very much a product of its time. And rather than having to defend that genocide as being like, this was what God wanted and we have to figure out why it's okay, instead of to be like, well, maybe that's not what God wanted. And then, we could even go more kind of like pull back into a more like atheist or agnostic position to say, like, this is just, basically ancient societies doing what ancient societies did. And the idea that we have to somehow spiritualize this is kind of ludicrous. So I think that's kind of what I would want to go to first before we even get into, like, is it what God wants or not kind of thing? It's like, how do we even know what God wants? Like, there's all these kind of bigger questions. And I think it's really important to ask these, because a lot of people do just assume, if, like, being raised in the church that I was in, I think you guys too, like, you just kind of hear this is just in the air, that the Bible's infallible. Inerrant is the big word. The Bible's the inerrant Word of God. You can't question it. So instead of spending our time trying to, like, hold up that belief, what if we step back and said, like, well, where did that belief come from in the first place? And that's where you start to get into, like, a much more probably healthy relationship, I think, to no matter where you end up in faith, even if you don't stay at, some kind of evangelical fundamentalist, I think you can get to a better place both in faith and outside of it as well, by not just kind of running with that assumption.
Yeah, exactly. I'm also curious, could you take us back in time and explain how apologetics developed through Christian history and how it's evolved since then a bit?
I think, like, if you look at Christian history, and this is one of the things that surprised me when I went to seminary, Christian history for, I don't know, the first, can I say 1,000 years, was just kind of intellectual history. Like, if you go and read some of the bright lights in church history, for example, you could read somebody like Thomas Aquinas, who's like really, really smart guy. And he was engaging with Aristotelian philosophy that had just kind of come over from, like, contact with the Islamic world. And just this guy who's like working on this kind of intellectual tradition. So if you study, whether you go into a philosophy class or a theology class, to some extent, you're going to read the same people. You're going to read Plato. You're going to read who else? And you'll eventually get down to people like reading like Immanuel Kant or like like Hegel or something. But theology and philosophy are pretty much the same discipline for a long time. That fundamentally these big kind of philosophical questions, once the church kind of had dominance, a lot of these questions were happening within the context of the church. So it's interesting to look at like, to sit in a philosophy class and look at somebody like Immanuel Kant and be like, he's actually in a lot of ways trying to wrestle with a worldview that still contains God in some way. Like he's still trying to understand like how we can have these kind of philosophical investigations, but then still maintain an idea. For him, I think it's like, I'm not a philosopher, but I think it's basically the idea of like the numinous, the phenomenological, that there can be things outside the realm of our knowing. And this is how you kind of get some room for God there, I think. So, I mean, it's really, I think when you look at the history of Christianity, it's a lot of incredibly bright people. The one thing you do get is the foundation of what we think of, most of us think of as like an American fundamentalist type of way of looking at the Bible in the world, really came out of the 18th century. What happened in Germany and in Europe, there was a lot of this higher criticism of the Bible. So people were saying things like, well, the Bible is just a myth, for example, or maybe Jesus was a magician, but not the Son of God, or maybe I don't know, just like different, like pulling that kind of stuff apart, or pulling apart manuscripts and realizing manuscripts of the Bible have contradictions in them, and we need to figure out what to do with that. So we invented a discipline called text criticism, that you can put manuscripts side by side and try to figure out scientifically which one is older, the earliest or whatever. So you had this happening, and what happened in America, and even at this point, I'm pretty sure it was primarily at Princeton where it kind of started, but it spread and had a lot of different manifestations. But in America, you had a pushback to this, that like this idea that we could just treat the Bible like a scientific, like kind of scientific approach to the Bible, assume that, if there's stories about Jesus that are larger than life, well, we should call that mythology and assume they're not true. There's a big pushback among American Christians. And a lot of that was what kind of gave rise to this like belief that the Bible is the inerrant word of God. That became a word that started being used more, and it was actually formalized. If you read, I think it was just in the 1970s, there's something called the Chicago Statement on Biblical Inerrancy. So the Christianity that we were all raised in a lot of ways started as I don't want to say anti-intellectual movement. There were streams of that, but it was really as a reaction to intellectualism. Like it was a reaction to people who wanted to study the Bible with what we could call scientific, maybe, or like kind of critical historical methods. And the reaction was basically like, don't touch it. Like the Bible is the word of God. So in American Protestantism, you ended up getting a higher and higher view of the Bible. And that's what, I mean, most of us were raised in. But what happens, so coming back to apologetics, most of the history of Christianity, as I said, was these incredibly bright people. But within this context, you started to have people trying to develop their own kind of, I guess maybe we could call it intellectual tradition, in air quotes. So, for example, like when Darwin wrote *Origin of the Species*, and a lot of Christians kind of just accepted evolution to begin with, but eventually in like the mid 20th century, you had this pushback, and that's when the creationist movement started. And what does it look like? It looks like kind of a pseudoscience. It's people who sort of have some scientific credit. Like they are starting from the presupposition that in their case, we know the world is, 6,000 years old and creation happened in 7 days because Genesis, but then they're looking for evidence for that. They're looking to try to justify that. So that becomes a sort of pseudo-intellectual movement. And I think you see that in creationism, but you see it with the biblical study side of things too. You see people pushing back against my discipline that I was trained in biblical studies. And you see people like, when I was a kid, one of the big names was, what's his name? Josh McDowell, Evidence That Demands a Verdict, or The Case for Christ is another great example. Like these are more popular books, but these were very much that evangelical kind of attempt to protect and guard against secularism or against like liberal historical kind of Christian impulses. And the way that they did this was by creating a sort of alternate intellectual tradition, or an alternate facts, almost like alternative facts. So a lot of us were raised in that. We didn't really know where it came from. We just kind of took it for granted that this is smart and we can defend this because because we're smart and we have good beliefs, and a lot of us never really realized that sort of apologetic impulse came out of a very specific kind of historical thrust and a very specific manifestation of 20th century American Protestantism. The point that I always want to say is that like Christianity is not stupid. It's like Christianity has a really long, like brilliant intellectual tradition. And even if you sit in any philosophy class, half the people you're going to read are Christians, right? At least if you go back beyond last century. But what we ended up with was what I would consider a very bankrupt intellectual tradition, that it's people sort of posing. It's people sort of not really having the study, already deciding what we want to believe, and then going out to find the evidence for it. So I just made a video a few weeks ago where I was critiquing a guy named Ravi Zacharias, who was one of my heroes growing up. And Ravi never actually got a doctorate. He had some honorary doctorates given to him by different institutions, but he called himself Dr. Ravi, and he pretended he had this kind of fake association with Oxford, and so there was a lot of that play acting. It was a lot of like pretending that we're intelligent people and pretending that, we're just following rational inquiry and that's what's getting us to this like inerrant word of God or whatever. But it was always the reverse. It was always trying to find the answers to justify what we believe in the first place.
What role did apologetics play in your own faith journey? Were you raised evangelical?
Yeah, I was. I was raised in a little denomination called the Plymouth Brethren. So it's we didn't believe in having ministers. So it was kind of like any man basically could speak and teach, which sounds kind of nice. I think it sounds kind of egalitarian, but all it means is that it was probably even more anti-intellectual because nobody had any theological training or any sense of like if people did read stuff, they would just read the books from our denomination. They would never think to open a biblical history book or something. So it was a tradition that was really kind of, I'll say simple. I'll be nice and call it simple. Women were not allowed to speak, and any man was kind of expected to speak. So, I mean, from a young age, I was doing speaking and things like that. I don't know exactly when my enjoyment of apologetics kicked in. But I mean, I remember just being in high school and like, I believed this stuff, but it seemed kind of dumb. And, I was coming into like sitting in a science class and hearing about evolution and thinking, well, that's not true. I know that, they're just, and the other thing apologetics often does is paints scientists and like paints real intellectuals as if they are just out to get God or something like that. Right. So I'd be like, well, I know my science teacher just hates God and doesn't want to consider creationism, even though there's better evidence for creationism. So that was like my first attempt to kind of defend. And I think I knew apologetics was there. Nobody wants to go through life feeling like they're stupid. Right. So I think, the idea that it could be the intellectually best position, like the best intellectual choice for anybody who really took the time to actually investigate, that felt really good to me and was really attractive. So I started reading people like C.S. Lewis. I had a good friend who was much smarter than me who read this kind of stuff. So I think I also really looked up to him because he was sitting around reading people like Augustine and doing this kind of stuff. And I worked with him at a camp once, and he was a good friend. But so I think he really sold me as well that there's like a deep intellectual tradition here we should be taking part in. And for me, that kind of manifested as C.S. Lewis, which a lot of evangelicals like C.S. Lewis, Ravi Zacharias. So I moved towards the kind of more philosophical side of apologetics. I didn't spend too much time with the biblical study stuff until I was already in my training. And by that time, it was already too ridiculous to pay much attention to somebody like Lee Strobel anyway. But yeah, that's kind of where I came from.
And what would you say is the main purpose of apologetics? Is it about convincing skeptics or strengthening believers, or what would you say it is?
I don't know. I think if you asked an apologist, a lot of people would say their purpose is, to give an answer, which might be to a believer or might be to a skeptic. The way I see it, it seems to mostly just be reconvincing people who are already in the tradition or who have some background in it and are coming back to it or something. I don't know. I'd be really curious to know if there are people who listen to an apologist and are convinced that Christianity is the best kind of intellectual tradition. And I think apologetics, we can't forget too, it's performance in a way. It's very much like theater almost, which is kind of why I was talking about Ravi and his fake credentials. Like it's an attempt to help people believe that there's a big intellectual tradition in Christianity, which there is. But when you have somebody like William Lane Craig, who is by all accounts like exceptionally well-trained theologian, But then he still goes and argues about like why God could kill the Canaanites and that's okay. So you have to ask, like, is this his intellectual pursuit leading him here, or is this like his presuppositions? So I don't know. I don't know if it convinces a lot of people or converts a lot of people, but it's certainly, I think the play acting kind of intellectualism can be very, very attractive.
Well, that's why I was curious. So could you provide some examples of some of these apologetic arguments that overreach or become ethically problematic in their attempt to defend the Bible?
Yeah, when I talk about my field, I'm talking about biblical studies. So what I get with biblical studies is, the example I could give is Wes Huff. Wes was on Joe Rogan, and he kind of gave a few things, but the one that kind of has still kept resonating is the idea that there's this text of the Hebrew Bible. So we have before the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the earliest manuscripts of the Hebrew Bible were from about 1,000 years later. This is the Leningrad Codex. And the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, and that brings back the text tradition like 1,000 years earlier. So Wes had said this on Joe Rogan and essentially said like, oh, well, and this proved that the text hadn't changed in 1,000 years. And Joe's like, wow, that's amazing. Like how else could that happen if it wasn't from God? Now, the thing is, it's not true. Like it's actually Dan McClellan did a really good breakdown of this, but open any critical edition and you can see that those two editions of the text are not identical. So this is kind of what it always starts from, is like a very, very high estimation of the Bible. I'm going to say the New Testament. Let me just stick to the New Testament for a minute. So for my field, I would have to engage a lot with people who think that the Gospels are eyewitness accounts, for example. So somebody will say, well, the Gospels are eyewitness accounts. We can trust them 100%. But I don't know many serious scholars who would ever think the Gospels are directly eyewitness accounts. I can't think of anybody. But what you would hear from somebody, well, let's use the Case for Christ as an example because it's sexy. And there was recently a movie that came out about it. In the Case for Christ, that's the one of the whole things is like, well, this is like, these were testimonies by people who knew Jesus, and which is not true, and saw the things they saw, and they wrote it down very soon after Jesus died, which is also not true. And like, so it's creating this sort of alter narrative that completely flies in the face of what actual biblical scholars say. And then when biblical scholars come along and say, well, these are literature, okay? Like, it's very clearly literature. Who's with Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane watching him sweat great drops of blood? Like, even just as like a technical description of eyewitness accounts, this fails. But then you realize they're actually just literary accounts. And what you have is Matthew and Luke, for example, copying the Gospel of Mark and adapting it to their own purposes. And they don't copy it and say like, oh, well, Mark says he saw Jesus, go to Capernaum on the 12th, but I saw him go on, I thought it was the 13th or something. Like, it's not different accounts like that. It's literally the accounts of somebody who's changing a literary narrative. So, for example, in Mark, you have this story of Jesus' family coming to basically stop him from ministering because he's out of his mind. They all think he's out of his mind, his mother and his siblings. And Mark doesn't have a nativity story. So Mark doesn't have these stories about Mary having the angels come to visit her and say, you're going to give birth to a son and all this kind of thing. So when Matthew and Luke copy Mark, they don't keep that story in for obvious reasons, because they both have stories that explain why Mary knows exactly what's going on with her son and why he's going to be, basically God's anointed. So to leave that story in where all of a sudden Mary doesn't know what's happening and comes to stop Jesus from teaching because he's out of his mind, it's kind of unthinkable that you would leave that in after you've already explained why God came to Mary in these visions. So they take it out. You can very nicely see in each case, they've just kind of omitted that story. They include material before and after, but they don't include that story specifically. So that's not a case of different eyewitnesses. That's a case of having different literary needs for your gospel and adjusting it to fit your literary needs. And now that you've added a birth narrative to Jesus, it changes the way you have to tell the story, right? So like, that's one example of how the Gospels are clearly not eyewitness accounts. We don't even see, the Gospels are like, they could be second century. Like there's just so little we actually know about where they came from. But then you have like Acts, which is not a story of the history of the church. Acts comes out in the late second century too. Like Acts is not, it's not a first century document that's close to the account. It's later mythology. The really popular one is about Jesus' resurrection, to look at 1 Corinthians 15, where Paul says like, well, Jesus appeared to, all these people, Cephas, then 500, and then to me, basically. So, there's that's an eyewitness account that Paul gives, and it's really close to the moment, and it's somebody who actually saw what's going on. And that's like, that one kind of falls apart too. So it's just like, that's a lot of the kind of arguments you get, is an attempt to make the Bible more than what it is, an attempt to basically undermine every criticism and paint biblical scholars in my discipline who do great work, to paint them all as kind of heretic skeptics who just don't want to accept the obvious truth to them that whatever, the Gospels are eyewitness accounts. And then, so that's kind of what I see in my discipline. And I mean, you could attach this to philosophy, where you get these big problems of like good and evil and human suffering and the answers. You could paint this on evolution. I know like Christians have differing approaches to how to handle evolution. Obviously, not all Christians are like, well, it had to be a 7-day creation in Genesis. People have different approaches to that. But again, you get different apologetic approaches to creationism or intelligent design or whatever they want to call it. So that's kind of a summary of how I see it. Yeah.
I think that's a really important point to bring up. And that's actually what I was going to say, is that apologetics often ignores the scholarly consensus. Mm-hmm. Like the fact that the gospel writers were anonymous and not eyewitnesses, and things like the global flood and the Exodus that lack archaeological evidence. Yeah. Or, how some prophecies were written after the events actually took place. And I think that's like an important thing to acknowledge.
Exactly. Yeah.
Not to mention things like whose name is attributed to what, like the gospel writer Q, for example, right? That they find throughout a lot of these texts.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So it's all, it's the way that we actually engage with texts. As historians, we're doing something very different than what apologists often want us to do. And if I have somebody pushing back, which I often do, I have certain people in my comments who are apologists, and I kind of know what they're doing, and they'll often, it's never a surprise what they say. Like it's always going to be the very predictable, well, they just say the same things again and again to kind of defend their presuppositions. And I think they think they're being intelligent. I think they think that they're genuinely looking at evidence. But like, if you're not willing to ask hard questions about where this came from or what it means or whatever, then you're not really doing scholarly work, which, by the way, is okay, I think. Like, I think you could just read these as faith documents, but just don't try to pretend you're a scholar. That's part of the thing that annoys me, is like, I don't care if you want to read these as a faith document and say, like, this is meaningful to me because it helps me understand my faith. It describes miracles, maybe a resurrection that you can't prove because people aren't raised from the dead. That's a miracle of God. Okay, like I couldn't fight against that as a biblical scholar. What am I supposed to say to that? But, when you want to make it like, oh no, we know, and this is proof and whatever, then you're doing this kind of Protestant rationalist type of thing to pretend that we can find materialist evidence for this, and you can't.
Yeah. And apologists, they often treat difficult questions like they're threats, or that doubt gets labeled as rebellion, and critical thinking is discouraged in favor of, just have faith. But I always thought, if faith can't survive a question, then maybe the problem is in the question.
Yeah, very much so. That's kind of what I found. I mean, I always was told, follow the evidence where it leads, and, God is big enough for your questions or whatever. But then inevitably, sometimes when I didn't get to the right answer, it was like, well, you need to just stop believing, or stop questioning and just believe, or turn your brain off to some extent and just believe. And that was very unsatisfying to me. I thought, like, if the evidence is pointing in a different direction, then maybe I should just deal with the ramifications of that rather than trying to keep pretending it is what I want it to be.
Yeah, no, I always want to leave some room for being convinced, in my position now. But, I never found it to be all that convincing, because it always felt like something that believers use just to kind of reassure themselves than to actually persuade other people. I just never found the arguments all that persuasive. And, they'll go to any lengths to defend it because of the presuppositions. The Bible's true and God is good. So like when God has 10 of David's wives raped for David's adultery, that kind of a thing, where it's like, is this justice? I never heard a good response to something like that. Or, the children who mock Elisha for being bald, he calls upon a curse, and 2 bears maul the children.
Yeah.
And in my mind, like, if this was like a moral story, it would have seemed like, maybe what if the outcome was these children mock a prophet of God for being bald, and then their hair falls out. And like, that would be like true justice. And that would be like a good moral to the story of like, you make fun of somebody for this, and then that happens to you.
Yeah.
But what we see is like this extreme case of violence that just doesn't seem justified.
Yeah.
And so like, that's another one that I've never heard a good apologetic for that is convincing for like why an all-loving, all-knowing God would do this kind of a thing.
Yeah, exactly. I agree. I think it's very much wishful thinking. It's very much driven by psychological safety. I think like people have different needs when they join a community, a faith community. And I think some people will prioritize the need to belong, the need for that like place to belong and be accepted. And I think as humans, like in a very evolutionary sense, we're social animals. Like we're looking for this kind of pack that we can belong to. We're looking for a place to belong. And I think often what happens with churches is if you can give people sort of a pseudo answer, I think they're going to stop looking to some extent, because a lot of people are just going to be content to be like, well, okay, the Trinity doesn't totally make sense to me, but I'm just going to trust it. And that's what I need to do to kind of belong here. That why I don't know why God would kill those kids for making fun of Elijah, but let's say God has a reason that's bigger than mine. And I think for some people that's enough. But I do think there's a lot of people, especially we have this generation, if you look at many of us deconstructing, being raised with education and endless access to information at our fingertips to actually push back and say like, wait a minute, that doesn't quite sit right with me, and are we really going to just accept those kind of simplistic explanations that people have accepted in the past? For a lot of us, the answer is no. Some people obviously do. But I mean, it's just to me, it's a bankrupt faith. And I wish we could have both. I wish we could look honestly at our faith tradition. I still call myself a Christian. I still hang out in Christianity, but the idea of having to go back to that sort of like intellectually bankrupt, just chains around every question I can ask is just like, that's a nightmare. I would leave before I went back to that. Like, it's just really terrible way to live.
Yeah, and just being able to be honest and be like, I don't know, I don't have a good response to this. I might have to think about this or look into it more. Answering that way honestly, I think is a better approach instead of having to have an answer for everything. If you don't know, then sometimes it's just better to say, I don't know.
Yeah, exactly. And that's like, I think Bible scholarship has helped so much too. I mean, Bible scholars get painted as the enemy often, but it's like, if you look at somebody who studies the Hebrew Bible and they're going to tell you, well, women were actually considered property at this time.
Mm-hmm.
Like, do we want to turn around and say like, well, then that's God's will? Or should we actually say, well, maybe if we are going to read these texts devotionally, we have to work a little harder to get what the lesson actually is and be careful of actually just trying to replicate the horrendous patriarchal society that these were written in, because I don't want to live in that society. And
right.
I don't think anybody does really. So it's kind of like, I think being a little more grown up about how we handle text as well.
Yeah, looking at like the 10 Commandments and seeing that, women are included in the list of properties. Do not covet your neighbor's, oxen and house and wife. They're all kind of put in these categories of like possessions, or do not covet your neighbor's slave. It's troubling.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just kind of curious how these sort of like how modern values kind of clash with these traditional readings as far as, from an apologetics angle in your view.
It's interesting because I think I'll use two really problematic words, but I think they'll kind of help us kind of talk about this. If I say liberal or conservative, liberal Christian, conservative Christian, a lot of people are going to think of conservative Christians are the ones who kind of don't compromise on moral values, whereas liberal Christians are the ones who are like, yeah, well, gay marriage is okay because, we're liberals, let's say. So I think the irony is like, we're always evolving on moral values. Like all of us all the time are evolving on moral values. And there are things like when I was a kid, for example, it was drinking and dancing were the two evils. And then I remember by the time I went to university, there were, I didn't see dancing become too popular, but people at least stopped thinking it was a sin. But I remember drinking, like all of a sudden people wanted to have like beer Bible studies and that kind of stuff. And like, where did that come from a world where drinking was a sin, even to just have a drink? So it's just like, this is always in flux. And the idea that the Bible is just this final say on morals and ethics, and we can just read it and it'll tell it, like, it's ridiculous. It's absolutely ridiculous. And no matter where you land on the spiritual spectrum, we all have to engage with ethics and morals like adults, and we all have to make decisions. And there's reasons why even the most fundamentalist Christians will, look at some teachings of Jesus and say, well, if you've looked at a woman with adultery or like with lust in your eye, it's better to cut your eye out. Like, I think we all tend to be okay taking that one sort of metaphorically, but then to turn around and take something else literally. It's just like we all make decisions about this all the time. So there's no like superior ethic or moral tradition that comes from just reading the Bible at face value. We always have to negotiate with the text.
Yeah, and unfortunately that's what you see a lot of people that are using the apologetic of, this part here is literal, and then when I get to a section that maybe I don't like, maybe that's metaphor, and you're like,
yeah, that's right,
just jumping around, when there's like actual genres to the books, and there's You can't just cherry pick little parts and say, well, that's a metaphor. This is not, you got to be consistent, I think.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
That's what I was wondering. Do you think that just for people who are deconstructing, do you think apologetics are helpful, or does it tend to push people away in your view?
I don't know. I mean, I could turn it back to you guys. Like, you
Sure.
guys have gone through this. You talk to a lot of people. Like, do you find it helpful, or do you find, for me, it wasn't, but.
No, I find it backfires. I find when I hear in my opinion, some of the bad arguments that are made, it makes me think that they're just trying to find ways to sort of, be comfortable with some of the issues that are there, that are present, and I think it makes me think that they're just trying to defend it at all costs, as opposed to, like Jake said, or you were saying, like, I don't know, or maybe I need to research this more.
Right. Yeah.
I think there's definitely a psychological aspect to it, defending belief systems, not because they're true, but because they are comforting. And so, like, I get it. I mean, people often cling to those arguments because, it feels unsafe to admit uncertainty. I think sometimes it's less about truth and more about just keeping that world from falling apart.
That's really true. And then the thing I think that the thing that really does piss me off about apologetics is that it has consequences. Like, these ideas have consequences. So even if apologists often will talk like these are just like big, hypothetical questions, and we're just talking about big ideas. But like, when you defend, for example, the inerrancy of the Bible, you are therefore like giving license to that parent who wants to kick out their gay kid because they've decided that they need to spare the rod and spoil the child, or whatever. It's like, these have real ramifications on people's lives. So apologetics isn't just playing with ideas. In some ways, I think it justifies propping up a system that doesn't need to be propped up, and should be in a lot of ways torn down. Like, I don't want to go back to that world that I lived in the 90s, and I'm guessing maybe you guys have this too, that constant rapture fear and the like ridiculous end time stuff, the like over analyzing every news clip because it might be a sign that the end is near. And I remember like being a kid and being worried that my parents were being snatched away. Like, that's a terrible way to grow up. So I think like the idea that we need to the idea that doing apologetics in a lot of ways stops Christians from actually engaging critically with their tradition. And they just think, well, that just means we keep subordinating women, for example, because the Bible is very clear that women, shouldn't have authority over a man, or something like that. Well, yeah, because that's the world that the Bible was written in. It was a sexist world, and a lot of that sexism got reinscribed back into the text in different ways. Not always. I mean, in some ways, early Christianity was pretty egalitarian in ways we could talk about. But it's I mean, to argue that apologetics is just about convincing people, it's not. It also has real life hurt on people, and it really does convince some people that they can keep basically being assholes and think that they're justified in it, basically. So.
That's a great point to bring up, actually. I mean, we just had, what was it, September 23rd was the supposed rapture that was going to happen, that became kind of big on TikTok.
Yeah, that's right.
Do you think that apologetics, kind of like what you're saying with the real world ramifications, do you think that ties into kind of Christian nationalism, how they're using power to sort of push these agendas?
I'm sure it does. Because I'm Canadian, I'm a little bit out of the whole thing. Like, I've never really actually sat in like a Christian nationalist church, but then people tell me stories about it. I'm like, wow, that's crazy. So like the closest I got when I went Pentecostal for a little while, and there was a lot in Pentecostalism, there was a lot of kind of talk about like the nation and the God of the nation and bring our nation back to Christ. Like, there was a lot of that kind of stuff in the Pentecostal church I went to, but I've never really experienced Christian nationalism other than, seeing videos on YouTube and stuff. But yeah, so I'm guessing it probably does. And that's kind of the same thing. It's like when even if you want to stay in the Christian tradition, like, we should always be critiquing our tradition rather than trying to play language games to uphold it at all costs. Like, traditions are always evolving, and that's okay. So I'm guessing the answer is yes, but you guys could probably maybe speak to it better than me. I don't have as much on the ground knowledge, as it were. It
seems like apologetics has gone viral on YouTube and TikTok. Do you think that's changed the tone or focus of the discipline?
To some extent, yes. I find most of them pretty uninspiring, but that's not really the point, because I think there are Christian kids who do, are turning to these kind of TikTok apologists to justify their faith. And again, yeah, that turns into maybe Christian nationalism or maybe sexism or whatever. So Yeah, I think it is definitely there, and I think it's given them a reach that is quite scary, honestly. But I mean, we did always have this huge evangelical culture. Even when I was a kid, it was there's a huge reach in evangelical culture and a lot of money behind it. But I think social media certainly gives it a whole new dynamic. And unfortunately, I think it's getting better and better all the time. But I think you don't always hear the counter views from people who have training and who know what they're talking about. But there are more and more of those people all the time.
Yeah, I kind of like that, seeing people that have actual credentials, that are actual scholars, and they can sort of address these things and sort of clear up some of the misconceptions, because those things do get spread, and then misinformation gets spread, and then people just repeat these bad talking points. And it's good to like call them out so that we can at least, kind of set the record straight on certain things. An example of that recently would be Charlie Kirk, who passed away recently, and it was a very unfortunate event. But just some of his arguments that he would use, and then Dan McClellan challenged some of those. And as a biblical scholar, he just flat out said, that's just wrong, or that's just not a good interpretation.
Yeah.
And I think that's important too, to have those people to kind of come along, and it's not just two people's opinion; it's somebody who actually has the education and the credentials to kind of set the record straight.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, and I'd love to see more of that. I know it's funny because when I was doing my PhD, which was a while back now, there wasn't that much talk. People would talk about public engagement, but it usually meant like writing an article in the newspaper or something. Like nobody was talking about getting on YouTube. But all of a sudden, you're seeing more and more people with real credentials getting on social media, and it's great. I think we need more of it, frankly, more of it, and need to help people with credentials get better at it and understand how to do it better and all that sort of thing, because it really is. It's honestly, but I don't like saying like a war or a battle or something, but it genuinely is like there's so much misinformation, and even correcting a portion of it makes a difference, because it's just never ending.
Totally. Well, that's why we're excited to have you on, because we know you have a lot of credentials, and we really appreciate this conversation.
Awesome.
How can people stay intellectually honest while also spiritually open?
I think one of the first things I would want to say is that intellectual honesty and spiritual openness are not necessarily at odds with each other. But I think a lot of us who have been raised in that apologetic space do think that, we end up instinctively thinking like, oh, we can't ask too many questions or whatever, like we've already talked about. So I think I don't tend to say this very much because it's a little bit cliche, but I do hear people say it, this all truth is God's truth kind of thing. I encourage people to follow the evidence where it leads and to engage for real with intellectualism, whatever that looks like. Whether you're like an armchair expert who just loves going deep on biblical studies, or whether you're going to go study it at a university or college or something. I think for me, like one of the things that was really transformational for me that really helped a lot is that I deconstructed in seminary.
The cemetery.
The cemetery, exactly. Yeah. Maybe I should just say real quick, just so people know my story. I was a youth pastor in a Baptist church at this point, and I was looking around for how to get certified to do full-time ministry. And we didn't have like a fundamentalist seminary in, I almost said cemetery. We didn't have a fundamentalist seminary in my city, but there's an Anglican seminary there. So I went there. And that's kind of what really prompted my deconstruction, was studying the Bible and church history and realizing a lot of what I believed about it was wrong. But the one thing that really was, the one thing that kind of stayed true is I always had this idea is that like, you don't have to be stupid to be a Christian. That was something I had from my teenage years that kind of sparked my engagement with apologetics. And that never went away. I mean, I still think that today is like, you don't have to be stupid to be a Christian. Like there are some incredibly bright people in Christianity. Like somebody was just, made these videos talking about my faith, and I've had a few people say the name David Bentley Hart to me. And I went and I've just been watching some of his videos this week, and like, oh man, I wish I was half as smart as that guy. Like these are brilliant people in the Christian tradition. I deconstructed in seminary, but I was reading like Kierkegaard and like like the great theologian, like Friedrich Schleiermacher, some of these like amazing theologians who are so freaking smart. And there's one thing that to this day, I would never accuse the Christian tradition of being stupid. Like the evangelical Christianity that we inherited is borders on stupidity sometimes, but there is a deep intellectual tradition here. One of the things I love about Christianity is that there's such a willingness to engage with some of these huge philosophical questions. Part of that comes, frankly, because Christianity has been, from its very moment of infancy, very closely tied to Greek philosophy. So we've had that kind of tradition of asking big questions and trying to, doing this kind of deep philosophical inquiry. So I think spiritual openness certainly doesn't have to be at odds with intellectual inquiry. In fact, I think they can go together. But I do think when you have that type of intellectual inquiry, your faith will probably evolve, and that's okay, but it's scary. And I think if you expect to go do like a deep look into X subject, I don't know, whatever it is, like whether you're a scientist or a philosopher or a historian or whatever it is, you're going to come out with a more complicated view of your faith or of the world or whatever. And I think that's fantastic. I think that's a really good thing. The last thing we need is to go and come away. Imagine going to school and coming away with having all your presuppositions still intact. Like that's kind of pathetic. We should be evolving when we get educated. So I think it's the kind of myth that the whole point of spirituality is to arrive at the place where we know the right answers. I had somebody say, one of my kind of early mentor type people was a chaplain, an Anglican chaplain at the seminary I went to, who was kind of a safe person for me during what in some ways was a very difficult time. But one of the things he said to me after I defended my master's thesis and I was thinking about doing a PhD, he said, well, you should go do the PhD. And he said, God has given you a great brain and that's a gift and you should go and use it. And that sounds, I don't say that to kind of blow my own horn or whatever, but it was a moment where I had never heard anybody describe my brain, such as it was, for all its limitations, as being a gift from God. And that was a gift that he gave me in that moment to say, like, what I'm doing isn't at odds with the tradition I come from, even though it feels like it. That even this kind of deep intellectual inquiry can be a spiritual discipline in itself. So that's kind of stayed with me. And I think, I've pulled back and forth with the tradition a bit. I've, gone through a lot of periods where I, have a lot of doubts and consider myself an atheist or whatever. But at its heart, I've always seen this tradition as something that can handle a lot of big questions. And that doesn't go away. I love that about Christianity still.
Do you think that apologetics can evolve to meet the questions people are asking today?
I don't know. It's a very good question. I guess to some extent it could be back to this question we started with at the beginning, which is what is apologetics? So, if we define as apologetics as like, some kind of faith-seeking understanding or some kind of, I don't know, intellectual engagement with maybe some spiritual in the background. I don't know. I think any kind of apologetics that's based on this sort of Protestant way of knowing, that basically the whole point of knowing is just to get these kind of right faith propositions in our brain and come back to this list of things that I can check off that I believe. Using apologetics to kind of get you back there, I think is always going to be bankrupt. I don't think you can rescue that, because when your inquiry is driven by propositions, like it's always, there's a whole presuppositional apologetics as a discipline that does this, but I don't think that can ever go anywhere. But if we saw, I don't know, because some people will push back, and I had a guy, Randall Rouser, on my program who calls himself an apologist, and he's a really bright guy. He still identifies as an evangelical, but he's a super, super good theologian. I guess like maybe there's something there that could be saved. I don't know. I don't even know if we need the word at all, to be honest, but because human knowledge is human knowledge. I don't know why there needs to be a specific branch of it that's dedicated to like propping up spirituality or something. It's just like, it's all part of the inquiry of being human, which is in its own way, which is a spiritual discipline or spiritual, we're all searching, every scientist is searching, just like every theologian is searching.
Yes.
There's not different ways of searching. We're all looking for truth at the end of the day. Right.
Right. And at least with science, you're following the evidence to where it leads you, as opposed to trying to do the opposite.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what I'd rather see with biblical studies too, is there aren't a lot of traditions. I'm still working out my ideas on this, and there aren't a ton of faith traditions that this really works in yet, as far as I know. But if I follow the evidence where it leads and realize, well, the New Testament is full of errors, and it was written in the mid-2nd century, and it was later edited by people who put back in even more ideas that they wanted in there. Does that mean I have to be an atheist? Well, I don't know. I would like to think that my religious tradition could handle that, and that we could kind of evolve and come to see this more of like an evolving conversation about what is the true, the good, the beautiful. But unfortunately, what we often get instead is sort of dogmatism and fundamentalism and defending those propositions at all costs. So I'd love to see it evolve to something better, but I don't know. It's certainly not there yet.
Well, I love your nuance with it, that you're able to see that both ways, and to be able to question and to look at it more deeply. So I appreciate that about you.
Oh, thank you very much. I've been doing a lot of videos about this because people often wonder, because people are often like, well, how can you stay Christian if you know that, the Gospels aren't necessarily true or something?
Mm-hmm.
All those things, like coming back to that Christian tradition, so many bright lights in the Christian tradition trying to figure out what it means and how, like what it all means, how this all fits together. But for me, one of the things that really was transformational for me was that my PhD was actually in religious studies, not specifically in Christianity. So I would study all these human cultures, and seeing these human cultures that had religion as it almost just is human. I think I was poking at this on an atheist channel the other day, but I want to actually explore this, because I think there's an argument to be made that religion is just a human thing. At the very least, like the parts that make up religion, not like Christianity or Judaism or whatever, but like all of the things within religion are just human behaviors that we have in some ways decided are religious behaviors. So what I ended up finding was, I think religion is just something that humans seem to have with us. Like maybe we evolved it. I've interviewed somebody recently who believes that it evolved as a fundamental part of how we build societies, essentially, and how we work together and kind of don't kill each other. So what I eventually came to see as I studied this was religion seems to be a way of being human, arguably. And if religion is a way of being human, then my own Christianity, as much as like I was told as a kid, you have to make the right decision and believe to follow Jesus and all that sort of thing, I didn't really get to choose Christianity. This was just really the way that I was trained to be a human from a very young age, that like this is the language you speak for the divine. So what I found is as I've kind of gone through this journey, and I called myself an atheist for a little while, but eventually that gave me permission to come back and say, like, I'm very open to whatever else could be out there. I'm open to some kind of metaphysical reality. I don't know that any one religion encapsulates it. I'm a good flaky sort of flaky liberal type person when I see this, that like there's too many problems with the sort of like my tradition's right, everybody else is wrong. But what I do see is that in my tradition, there's an attempt by humans to make meaning and to try to see things in our reality that we don't always see and aren't always evident. So eventually I gave myself permission to just stay in this tradition as my way of engaging with anything else that could be out there. I might call it like my language for the divine or something like that. So it's more like speaking a language, or it's more like my particular, it's like I'm like a Canadian. I didn't choose to be Canadian. It's not the only country you could ever belong to and that it would be worthwhile, but it still has some meaning for me, So that became a way that I started thinking about religion. It gave me a way to practice Christianity again and be okay with it, and just recognize that it's a part of who I am. I like the connection with kind of where I'm from too. Like I was at a point in my life where I was looking for some identity, especially after leaving fundamentalism, and being able to stay in this tradition in a way that felt really authentic, but also helped me stay rooted to where I came from and my ancestors and that sort of thing. That was really cool too. So that's kind of where I hang out now. It's a very loose, I guess, Christianity, but giving myself permission to kind of stay and to explore these questions while I belong. And I'm not really looking for the right answer. I'm not looking for one day that I'm like, aha, the Trinity is true. Now I can finally say it. I don't really think that's ever going to happen. But this tradition is a part of who I am. So I'm always exploring new ways to stay connected to it in a way that's honest and feels real to me.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks for sharing that. That's great to get clarification on that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Chris, where can people find you as far as, YouTube? What are your social channels for listeners?
Yeah, so I'm on YouTube at CJ Cornthwaite. That's my initials, CJ Cornthwaite. So that's my YouTube channel. I also have a podcast called Footnote Famous, and that's my own podcast where I interview biblical scholars. So that you can find footnotefamous.com or on any podcast platform, or most of them. Look up Footnote Famous and you'll find it there. So CJ Cornthwaite or Footnote Famous.
If apologetics is about defending the faith, maybe the faith that needs defending isn't worth keeping. Huge thanks to Chris Cornthwaite for joining us and sharing his insight, and thank you for listening to Exodus Brothers.
Be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and follow us on Instagram and YouTube to keep the conversation going. We'll see you next time. Keep questioning, keep searching, and keep the dialogue alive.